As I said earlier, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our biomass financing webinar, one of three: concept development and project costing. My name is Sam Bayless. I'm a senior project manager at Valley Vision. Uh, we are the regional convener for the statewide California Jobs First program here in the capital region, which we call We Prosper Together. Over the last 2 years, the We Prosper Together initiative has worked with community leaders, local governments, local industry to really look at what the future of the capital region's economic development and economic future is going to look like, what the assistance is needed from the state of California, from the federal government, and really what the workforce is going to look like. So I really appreciate everybody joining today. I'm really excited to have Lindsey Nitta here, who is one of our sector investment coordinators for We Prosper Together, really focused on biomass. When we were looking at working lands as a priority sector for the region, biomass really came to the forefront, not just in the amount of activity and the amount of interest, but the alignment with the economic development and climate goals of California Jobs First as a program. So I'll go ahead and hand things over to Lindsey, but we have a great set of speakers for you today and hope that you learn a lot.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sam. And I'll just be quick since we want to get into it. We have, again, some great speakers and a lot to get covered. And just to reiterate, this came from the data that was collected and the research that was done with Brookings Institute for the We Prosper Together initiative, and really community interests. And so what we heard from people here today during the webinar and when we went out and did the Biomass Symposium and other community outreach engagement activities, that really understanding more on the business side and really setting up projects that can be financeable and get interest from developers and funders was really the big need that we heard over and over again. So that's where this webinar series was born. And I'm really excited to work with Luke and Neal to kick off this webinar with Valley Vision. It's really helping to get these projects from ideas and concepts, and again, to something that we can really tangibly work on and have a strong foundation to get more projects operational in our region. So I just mentioned that we did develop worksheets to help guide note-taking, and also just a place to take away that you can take for next steps and guide through the webinar. So please have those ready. But we will start off this session with Luke Carpenter. He is the Director of Investment from Blue Forest, a really great partner. They do so much work in this field. I'm sure he's seen millions of projects, and why we invited him is to really take it from more an investment standpoint of why it's really important to start put a lot of focus on the beginning with the concept development and costing, but also acknowledge some of the challenges and opportunities that he sees as well. So with that, Luke, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks. And Lindsey or Neal, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides here? Great. All right. Well, yeah, my name's Luke Carpenter, Director of Investments at Blue Forest. And today I'll be talking a little bit from the investor perspective of looking at wood and biomass utilization projects. So just as we start here, a little bit of background on who Blue Forest is. We are a conservation finance nonprofit working across the Western US, really focused on bringing new types of funding and financing to support ecological restoration. And one of our business divisions is called Blue Forest Asset Management. And this is how we invest directly into forestry supply chains. So we make both private equity and private credit investments into commercially operable businesses, really across the entire supply chain. So you can think of that as services, manufacturing, and technology. And we've deployed about $20 million to date into those businesses. And Lindsey was a little bit high with her estimate of millions of companies we reviewed, but we have looked at over 200 biomass utilization projects and companies to date, and most of these have been in California. So very relevant to everything we're going to talk about today. So first, I mean, there's a lot that we could talk about, and some of these ideas are sort of abstract. So I guess the first disclaimer is to say that I'm going to paint with pretty broad brushstrokes in what I talk about, and that hopefully a lot of these are applicable to many of you. But I also want to be really clear that just because I said something doesn't mean it's 100% true or it's applicable to every single one of you. And I realize there are a lot of different types of audiences on this call, right? And this subject looks really different if you are a project developer versus, say, a public official versus somebody else in the supply chain. And you may have some aligned interests and also some very different ways that you would interact with a new project. So because of that as well, I'll try to touch on some of those different project or perspectives throughout, but also just want to acknowledge that, that sometimes that's going to be a little bit different throughout. So first, when we're talking about, the very beginning of biomass utilization projects, right? I think the reason to start with planning is the same reason of anything else in life, is because it's going to save you time and resources down the road. And that's a consistent through line through everything else we'll talk about today. It means avoiding repeating processes later on. It means talking to the right people earlier on. And I also think one of the key pieces is also really understanding what is this fundamental challenge, right? Whether it's simply too much biomass or more specific things that need to be addressed. And then also understanding, okay, is this simply an issue like that can be solved in a day? Like this person needs to talk to this person, or is it structural? Say it is simply not profitable to do this, right? Figuring out those things really early on can really prevent a lot of headache. And I know that sounds incredibly basic, but really frequently we see these basic questions not getting asked. And then the other really big, I think, topic is to understand what the value creation opportunity is, right? If we're solving a problem, who benefits from solving it? And that can be, as simple as just who makes money, right? What is the profit motive to do that? Obviously very relevant to investors, but there are going to be a lot of other dimensions in that sort of mosaic of impact outcomes, right? It could be the local, water utility, or it could be simply a homeowner who has less wildfire risk. It could be the transportation agency because they need to do that work anyways, right? There are a lot of different ways to think about this, and it's really important to sort of think through it and then understand, because eventually we need someone to pay for it. And so who that is really matters to what value is being created and why it's being pursued. And then it's really important to focus the limited resources in these processes into a coherent direction and strategy. And so often we see sort of a scattershot approach of doing a little bit here and a little bit there and nothing getting done in its entirety. And so trying to prevent that and make sure that there's some intentionality behind it too. And related to that, creating a roadmap of, how do you get from point A today of having nothing to point B in the future of having something? And again, that's just the most basic sort of project management of having clear responsibilities and timelines. But then I think the nuance that often gets missed is the importance of sequencing. And so, we'll hear a lot about, say, feasibility studies, or when to start talking to investors, or when to start applying for grants, all of those sorts of things. And the sequence of those really matters. And we often see is the differentiator between successful and unsuccessful projects. And so actually putting that into a coherent plan in the very beginning can help make sure that the right focus is going to the right parts of those sequences. So then trying to be a little bit more specific here, what are the most common mistakes that we see in talking to projects? And this is, again, where there's a little bit of a different perspective of, say, if you are a county that is trying to attract a project versus if you are a project developer trying to pursue it. So keep both of those in mind. But I think the first one is that there's often this blanket assumption that there is an inherently profitable way to deal with biomass. And the reality is that a lot of really smart people have been trying to do this for decades and have had incredible challenges doing it. And if there was an easy way to make a lot of money, we would see big corporates doing it already, right? We essentially wouldn't have this challenge. And so that is not at all to be a pessimist or say that it's impossible, but it's to confront that reality in the very beginning that there may not be a structurally profitable way to deal with this from a pure market-based solution standpoint. And so that may mean subsidies. It may mean non-dilutive grant funding to pay for the capital infrastructure in the first place, may mean other types of financial and community solutions, right? And that's okay, right? Like that is a very reasonable outcome, but it's important to see that in a clear-eyed way. Um, the other really common mistake we see early on is groups getting attached to a specific market or product. Essentially just, hitching their horse to, say, the biochar wagon or the biofuels wagon, and just ending up there because they once heard about it on a webinar, or they had a friend that worked in it, or more commonly it's because they meet someone that convinces them that that's what they should pursue. And this is where I think there can be the most gray area and difficulty of understanding when it's time to choose the right partner versus when to keep an open mind and figure out what the core underlying investment opportunity and market opportunity is, and then let that inform what the right solution is, right? And so there's no correct way of how that should look for every project, but probably the number one reason we see projects fail is because they have the wrong leader, right? The wrong people managing it. The number two reason is because they have picked the wrong product or market that doesn't make sense with their local context, whether it's supply, workforce, funding realities, things like that. And both of those are avoidable problems, right? Like that's something that can be managed correctly from the beginning. Um, Another problem we see often is people developing really good innovations, but them not being the right fit for a single place. And this can be really difficult, right? Like we all live in a specific community. We want to see impact in a specific community. Even this webinar, right, is being hosted from a place-based perspective. But the reality is that, sometimes one product that's going to work in one, say, fire shed simply won't work in the next one over because they don't have the right workforce or they don't have the right log trucks or whatever it may be. And figuring out that match, it can be really difficult and can require hard choices of the developers, but is another reason that we often see these fail. And then I think the other common mistake that relates back to the sequencing that I mentioned earlier is using funds too early and on the wrong things. And this is the type of thing that really is not clear. And I think as a broad community in the biomass utilization world, we could do a lot better of trying to articulate and trying to work together to create a more coherent sense of correct sequencing. But an example of this is we'll often see people get a grant, immediately spend it on a piece of equipment, but then not have any capital to, say, run the equipment or to hire the right people to go out and raise the rest of capital. And so generally speaking, what we advocate for is actually spending initial capital to hire the right people. And that once you hire the right people, they are then capable of raising the vast majority of the capital that's needed to actually finish a project. And so, excited that Neal's on this call today, and we've seen him and his firm, other firms like them, be really helpful at being an intermediary step of bringing financial expertise in and helping advise and do this early work, a lot of which he'll present on here shortly, to make sure that, capital actually is being allocated at the right time and for the right uses. And then related to that, I think we just see a fundamental underestimation of how complex these projects are, both operationally and financially. And essentially people biting off more than they can chew, not because anyone's doing anything wrong, but simply because this is really, really hard work. And it's a lot easier to do it when there's an experienced operator who's done it before in that seat. And so that's the other thing that we see is groups often spin their wheels trying to do it without experienced operators. And eventually they come around to hiring experienced operators and then things move. So then what does good look like? Like, what do we want to see? And I'll emphasize just again, the number one thing is always leadership. It's always people, it's always the right management, and everything else comes from there. If the right people are in the right seats, then it's much easier to invest. They tend to be able to raise capital, they tend to develop the right materials, develop the right partnerships, etc. And so there are a couple different ways that you can find the quote unquote right people, right? I think one thing is if you're a founder, understanding what your strengths are, perhaps where there are gaps in your skill set, and then looking to bring in co-founders or advisors, or hiring out to say a fractional CFO or something else. That could be one solution. Another one that we've seen is looking at partnerships, right? That we've seen sometimes small entrepreneurs realize they simply don't have the resources and capacity to take on a big project. And they'll actually then partner with a major corporation and bring them in, and the bigger corporation or developer will take on that work. And that same impact still can ultimately be achieved through that type of work. And then I think the last piece here as well is this is more from like a government perspective, is bringing in a really sophisticated operator with a track record, right? Rather than waiting for, say, a entrepreneur to show up and sort of develop everything from the ground up, looking out and saying, okay, who are the people that have done this successfully at scale, demonstrated viability, et cetera? And then we're actually going out and targeting them to come in and work in your context. And we've seen that be increasingly successful in California as well across the West in recent years. So again, for that perspective of actually attracting those type of sophisticated operators and developers, there are three categories that we often see doing that. The first is funding, right? Beyond people, dollars are the most important thing. And sometimes dollars actually can be what attract the right people too. I know that we're in a constrained world, particularly from a government budget standpoint, but this ultimately is what moves the needle and is the difference in successful and unsuccessful projects, is just how much funding they get, particularly from non-dilutive sources. The second one is around site development. We've seen particularly counties be really successful in either securing sites or actually themselves owning land that they can provide at, almost free or very low cost leases to new facilities. This can also include things like helping with interconnection or permitting fast tracking. Those can be very helpful for developers as well. And then also workforce solutions. We've seen a lot of really great outcomes of local communities, nonprofits, government entities actually helping to source initial workforce for these businesses and also helping to subsidize their training and onboarding and all of that sort of thing. And ultimately, that is very positive from attracting a new business. For actual project developers, right, like once those developers are in place, or for an entrepreneur, I think there's no one size fits all, but generally, what investors are looking for is a simple, very clear business plan, right? Essentially articulating, this is our strategy, this is what we're going to do, who's going to do it, why we're doing it. These are the resources we have today. These are the resources we need to do it. And clearly identifying this is the opportunity and this is the risk, right? I won't go into all of that. There are a lot more sort of in-depth materials about business planning generally, but often we see that that's just a basic overlooked fact for a lot of groups trying to talk to investors. And then relating to that, I think a financial model that ties to the business plan. So that's essentially a quantitative projection of what is said in the business plan. Here's what we're planning to do. Here's what that looks like. Here are potential ranges of outcomes. And there's an important piece that relates to the financial model, is not just the business performance, but what you could think of as something like a balance sheet or the sources and uses of funding of, we're asking for X dollars today. Here's how it relates to the future cash flows we're projecting. And that's a sometimes, very difficult thing for non-financial experts to do, and also a reason to bring in that type of financial expert for talking to investors. And related to that, I think oftentimes we see a misalignment of what groups are asking for versus what their business needs. And I mean that in terms of, if it's a business that's going to take a couple of years to generate profit, then there's no sense in talking about debt service in year one. And again, this starts to quickly become really esoteric sort of financial concepts, which, there's no reason that everybody should know when they're developing this type of project, but it's very helpful to have outside experts that can help think through the appropriate capitalization structure for a business to then be able to target the right type of investors for that. Um, and then, yeah, related to that, supply analyses, particularly focusing on supply chains. We see so often that people focus just on is there enough volume with no consideration of how do we get it from point A to point B. And we've seen several new projects built across the West. They fully built it and they learned, oh, there are no truckers, or all the trucks here are the wrong size. And so they now have this infrastructure, all the materials in the woods, and they simply can't get it from point A to point B no matter how much they pay. And that's a really big problem, and that's commonly overlooked. But a good study can help identify that early on. Similarly, with sales plans, different types of businesses are going to have really different sales plans. If you're building bioenergy, you might be able to get a power purchase agreement, where if you're selling, say, lumber, you're going to be looking at commodity markets. There's no right answer there, but having a really clear strategy is what matters more than anything. Um, and then, particularly on the project development plan, we see very frequently just underthought plans in terms of the complexity of developing large scale infrastructure, and then around timing delays and budget overruns. We're currently seeing most projects in this space be at least 100% over budget, right? And that's on the low end. We've seen several be 200 to 300% over budget. And so that's another thing that is just important to account for early on in contingency planning and things like that. Lindsey, I'm happy to keep going here, but also want to be conscious of time and happy to turn it over to Q&A if now is the appropriate time.
Yeah, I think thanks Luke. This is really helpful. I appreciate it. Do we have any questions for Luke at this time?
Not seeing any yet.
Okay, great. I don't know, Luke, if you had some like closing words for us.
Actually, it appears there is someone with their hand raised. Daria, would you mind entering that in the chat or in the Q&A box? Thanks. But maybe you guys could have some additional conversation while they're typing that.
Luke, I don't know if you have any closing or additional thoughts that you'd like to leave people with today.
Yeah, the very last thing I'll just highlight is there is one very successful case study example in the state of California today. This is the Biomass Utilization Fund. Took about 13 years from initial fire that motivated it to get to today. Hopefully, we can start moving on faster timelines than that. But ultimately, the success of this came from securing funding, right? Getting $17 million that could then go to attracting these businesses, paying for those feasibility studies, both on the supply and business side to be done, and then attracting the right businesses to come in. One of those ended up being an existing business from another state that opened a new location. One of them is an entirely new business founded by an entrepreneur coming into that local area. But I think as we talk about, what does success look like, I would encourage everyone to review that model. I'm by no means an expert, right? There are a lot of other people that know more of the details here. But that's something I think it's important to both see the failures, but also the wins in the space and continue to learn from both sides of those. So, yeah, here's my contact. We're actively deploying capital. Always also happy to just be a reference to help people think through these things, make intros. And so would encourage everyone to reach out as I can be helpful or relevant.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke. That was actually part of Daria's question, is if you could facilitate introductions to investors, or are there investors who have expressed interest in viable projects, biomass projects in California?
Yeah, happy to follow up on that front. I'm not able to see the questions while I'm screen sharing, so happy to go into them now if you'd like. Otherwise, I can follow up with people by email afterwards.
Oh yeah. Yeah, she was asking, are there investors right now that have expressed interest in viable projects? Is there active people reaching out and looking for projects to invest in? Do you know?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say we're one of them, certainly. We're very actively looking for new projects. And then, yeah, I would say every project really has a different set of investors. Other than us, there are no like pure play sector um, specialists. But yeah, for things that look more like venture, there's a bunch of venture firms, particularly out of the Bay Area, that are interested in this. And then as they start to look more like growth equity or private equity, there's a very different set of investors. On the debt side, would encourage everyone to look up the TPEP loan program through the Forest Service and the federal government. And then we've also seen regional banks be lenders in this space as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And then we have one question from Gabrielle. At what point of the process should companies come to you, or you go to companies for thoughts and discussions? So when is that engagement with companies should start in the process?
Yeah, I would say it's never too early to reach out. And, I'll just be very transparent at um, when it is or isn't the right time for us to engage more deeply on a financing level. Generally, though, it's the right time to reach out to us when you're raising capital for commercially operable stages of your business. So we generally don't fund R&D or pre-project development. But when it's time to actually, put shovels in the ground, that's when we talk about actual financing. But even before that, it's helpful just to be in touch, get to know each other. We take a very long-term view of this. A lot of our investments, we've been talking to them for 3, 4+ years before that's the right time. And if we're not the right fit, we may be able to make introductions to someone else that is.
Oh, great. We'll take one more question, and then if there are additional questions for Luke, we can get those answers and share them out to the group. This whole webinar is being recorded and will be shared as well, so you'll have the slides in that. So don't worry if you missed anything or you want to revisit it. We'll provide those resources to you. So I think that was a question, but maybe Luke will provide one more before we close it out, and it's one that do biomass projects located in opportunity zones have a real benefit? So maybe we can expand it to like those with BDO zone designations or ratings, or the opportunity zones. Do you see that having a real benefit when it comes to financing a project?
I think generally speaking, yes, it can be positive. We as an organization don't get specifically involved in those types of tax incentives and regulatory incentives, but there certainly are other investors that do. And so I'm no expert in that field, but yeah, I think it is relevant, certainly.
Okay, great. I mean, that's the resource that we can also provide afterwards is more information about the benefits of the different opportunity zones and BDO zones and designations that could be helpful for financing. So really appreciate the questions. Thank you so much again, Luke. This was really helpful. And I know a lot of people stated that they really appreciate hearing from you and your perspective. Thank you again. If you have any last closing words before we move on.
No, just really excited to see so many people on this webinar and so much, yeah, momentum in the state. I think despite all the challenges we've had, we are making a lot of progress as a broader coalition. And so looking forward to being in touch and being a part of that.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, gonna move on. We're trying to keep this going because I know we're gonna take what Luke has said and the why and kind of getting it set up, and then Neal, our CFO and consultant that we're lucky to have, that will be joining us throughout the webinar series. So he'll be the one that's kind of going more in depth in talking about how we can put some of these concepts that Luke had talked about into action and down on paper. So with that, Neal, please go further into introducing yourself, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Lindsey. Speaking after Luke is a little bit like performing after the Beatles, but I'll give it my best shot. Really great to see so many people turned out today. My name is Neal Gottlieb. I live in Mill Valley, deep in the Redwoods, and I'm a fractional CFO by day, working across industries, including biomass, as well as I'm also a former entrepreneur. Go ahead and share my deck. As Lindsey mentioned, this is the first of three webinars. So thank you for joining us, and we very much encourage you to join us for the next ones as well. The next one's being productization on June 26th and financing mechanisms. But today we're going to talk about concept development and project costing, dovetailing what Luke spoke about, really getting into what is your concept, what are the ideas behind it, as well as most importantly, the finances behind it and how do you get it to market in an economically viable manner. We're going to have some polls pop up throughout and would appreciate if people could go ahead and answer those. And then we also have the worksheets. Those are just for your own reference. If you want to track along and help fill out some information for yourself, we are not going to be collecting those. So similar disclaimer to what Luke said. Sorry, the poll just popped up on my screen and doesn't want to go away. Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, so the poll is open. Just want to make sure that folks see that. And once I'm gonna maybe give it 20 seconds, and then I'll share the results, and everyone will be able to see that.
So, as most of you already probably know from your own experiences, and as Luke stressed, numbers by project can vary wildly by factors of tens or of hundreds. And there's significant factors that, of course, go in the scale of your project, the technology that you're using. If you're setting up a small scale electrical power plant versus just a really small scale biochar, you're going to look at, a project of millions of dollars versus one of tens of thousands of dollars. So every example is different. Site and regulatory complexity play a big role as well. And then, of course, when we're talking about biomass, which is in itself quite heavy and bulky and difficult to transport, the location of your feedstock as well as where you're offloading play huge factors into the numbers that go into a project and ultimately determine its economic viability. So I'm using some examples for the point of conversation. The important takeaway is to really dig deep into your own numbers for your project. Try to be honest with yourself. And of course, as Luke mentioned, with projects going 100%, 200% over budget here in the state of California at times, it's also super important to take those numbers and then build in significant contingencies. So we have something like 80 folks who are on the webinar. I'm really excited to see such great turnout. Don't be shy. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, speak about your projects. You might very well find that there's people that have already done what you're trying to do or have connections with the right people and resources to get there. So feel free to use the chat as we go through the webinar. And the Q&A is open. Feel free to drop those in. Those will be monitored, and we'll try to leave some time for more Q&A throughout. But if there's any clarifying questions as we go along, please don't hesitate to drop your questions in there. So why biomass? Obviously, everybody here has some interest in it. As we as a society have experienced climate change for whatever reason, and here specifically in the state of California, as there's been a significant amount of biomass building up in forests over the years, it has created a serious health crisis for the forest, and there's now more and more resources that are going into helping to address that crisis to prevent the kind of catastrophic forest fires that we've seen in the state of California in recent years. Also tied in with that, because of the crisis, we're also seeing some really strong policy tailwinds that are making it advantageous to pursue biomass businesses. And there's, of course, a lot of interest in those when there is the financial opportunity. So with the government resources that we have with interested private parties such as Blue Forest and private investors, it is a pretty exciting time to look at emergent technologies and opportunities in this field. So the project landscape, biomass, of course, can really include anything from waste on our forest floors to byproducts of lumber production to agricultural waste. So there's enormous amounts of resources that are available for the taking for relatively small amounts of money that can in turn also help our forest health. So these are just a few kind of types of exemplary projects. Ag biomass here in the central state of California and Central Valley, there's huge amounts of rice hulls, of walnut and almond shells. There's enormous amounts of biomass from orchards being torn out or from grapevines being torn out, both as kind of a routine annual process, as vineyards get renewed, for example, as well as the changing agricultural landscape in California. So those are materials that are available. Biochar, Luke mentioned, has been very much a hot industry, although many people are getting into it and finding that it's challenging to potentially make it work economically. Then there's projects that can be heat power. There can also be things like consumer goods that are using, say, rice hulls to make something like a Duraflame log or such. There's truly endless possibilities and newly emerging technologies. But the important thing to understand is, of course, the technology that you're interested in exploring will have very different economics and very different outputs. So that the key is to really understand what those inputs are, what revenue they can generate, what it's going to cost to generate the revenue, and how you in turn make a project economically viable and successful in the long term. So project types, just three exemplary ones. Heat only, that could be as simple as a tribe replacing buying fuel, using biomass for heat. These projects can be relatively small and simple to permit because you're not connecting with the grid. And depending on location, can really be economically advantageous. Ag bioprocessing, of course, very much there's a lot of opportunity in the Sacramento Valley. And these projects can vary from, the really small scale biochar that somebody does on site in tandem with an agricultural processor, or something much more significant that, say, generates electricity to connect with the grid. And then the topic of the hour, biochar. These systems can be really small and really something that's meant for just helping to utilize waste on a farm, to those that are much larger scale, intended to generate significant revenue through the sale of the biochar, as well as carbon credits that are generated in tandem. So Luke mentioned that, of course, people are the most important aspect of biomass businesses. I agree with that, but I think equally as important is having the biomass for the biomass businesses. I recently worked on a project with a firewood operator in Southern California, and they were looking to build a pellet mill. Seemed like a no-brainer, lots of opportunity down in the LA basin. But when we were brought on to look at the economics of the project, we quickly realized that the feedstock was problematic, in that the feedstock that was available was too far away for it to make economic sense. It was going to drastically inflate the costs of the project, and in turn, ultimately made it economically unviable. It was a tough lesson to learn so deep into a project, but it ultimately helped the company from investing in upwards of $10 million in order to pursue the project. So here in California, we're lucky to have lots of forests, residuals from industrial processes, as well as agricultural byproducts, and kind of the biomass that we get from orchard removals and vineyard trimmings on an annual basis. And then once we have our biomass and we have our facility, we have a great plan. The missing aspect is, of course, whom to sell your product to. And of course, products can be power in the form of heat or electricity or combined heat and electricity, or they can be physical goods like biochar, other soil amendments, wood pellets. The possibilities are truly endless, but the important thing as you pursue a biomass business is identifying those off-takers and pursuing contracts with them. It's probably the single most important aspect as you go out and seek funding is whether it's a bank or a private investor like Blue Forest, they're going to want to see, of course, that you have the biomass to make the business feasible, but then that you have the customers to make it economically feasible. And on this front, I would very much encourage people to think about not just an off-taker, I say the in the heading here, but really if there's the ability to have a diversified set of off-takers so that if one goes away, and you still have a continuity of your revenue stream. So, but having at least letters of intent when you go and seek funding, whether that be from a lender or private investor, is going to be crucial. At the early stages, it's quite difficult to get signed actual supply contracts because nobody wants to agree to buy something if they don't know what year it's going to be available. But letter of intents that are carefully worded and authentic can really go a long way to help to move your project forward. So then some fundamentals of feasibility. There's really kind of 6 different steps, and each step is unfortunately quite expensive. But also, as Luke said, the order in which you go about understanding feasibility can really be important to help lower your costs, right? Because the first step you want to take is to see, is this project even feasible as I imagine it, before spending potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars on going about and having your environmental review done or working with a local air quality board to get permitted. If you don't want to jump ahead and take those steps, if you're not actually going to have feedstock available, or if you create your financial model and you realize that it just can't make sense, that it would never pay for the facility yourself. So in the case of this potential pellet mill that I was working with, because the supply was so far away, the feedstock was so far away and was going to be so expensive to transport, we realized that the ultimate cost per ton of the pellets was going to be almost identical to what we could actually just buy pellets from on the wholesale market. So it was a huge price disadvantage simply because of the feedstock. In the case of this project, there had been hundreds of thousands of dollars invested into feasibility on the latter steps before bringing me on, and we worked out the financial model and just realized that it was unfortunately a no-go. If that analysis had been done earlier, it could have saved, in that case, it was close to $1 million or so. So really being mindful in your feasibility, being honest with yourself, getting outside opinions, and going about and understanding that important initial question of, is this project even feasible? And then, feasibility, I think, can be broken down into six main questions. Of course, as we've already mentioned, the feedstock and the off-taker, huge fundamentals, but then the site. And these all tie in together, right? You might say be located in Tahoe and decide that you're going to create a pellet mill, easy example. Well, if the feedstock isn't near there and the off-taker isn't near there, that doesn't mean that that business can't work, but it might not work at that site. Or there's other considerations as well, depending upon what your processing entails. Can that work in the location that you have in mind, or does it have to be located someplace else where what you're doing can work with the zoning, with the local air district, with access to the electrical grid, if that's the case. And simply, is the site that you have in mind, often, people have property that they've determined they're going to work with, whether they own it or it's a friendly lease that they can get. And that just might not be the best possible site for your business. It's important to have one in which the economics make sense. And the scale of the facility, scale of the site can grow with the business as well. So the economics, tying in the feedstock and off-taking and also the site, because certain sites, each site will have a certain cost associated with it, whether that be local taxes or expensive equipment having to do with as required by your local air district and such. Crucially important to simply do the research, whether that's on your own, with the help of the internet, and of course, highly recommend outside experts to understand what can the business look like, how much will it cost to get it up and running, what do the unit economics of each unit that you're selling look like, and is there truly a realistic path to sustained profitability? And then, of course, nothing happens without a team. When I was an entrepreneur for 15 years, which is actually an ice cream business, I always was felt like I was doing well when I could hire people smarter than me and people who knew their subject areas better than I ever did. I think that is a sign of success in entrepreneurship when you can build that team of people whose abilities can eclipse your own. And it ends up being crucially important, whether that be from the finance side, from the operations side, from the aspect of planning, feasibility, and going through construction. Having the right people who can make your project happen and happen in an economically viable way is absolutely crucial. And then, finally, permitting. Nothing else matters if the government isn't going to allow you what you'd like to do. And this is, of course, a big challenge at times here in the state of California, where we go forward with ideas for businesses and we might have the purest hearts believing in what we're doing and having strong arguments for how our project is going to help with forest health. But the people in the local community might not interpret it in the same way and can really serve to be significant roadblocks to getting your facility to a permittable state where it can be built and then in turn where it can operate. So as you go through those six questions on your own, I think it's important to remember that just because something is a challenge, it doesn't necessarily mean that your project is not viable. There might be things that you can do in order to change the economics of a project, to take those areas of concern to kind of, areas of green, like biochar, for example. The economics of one project may be that you have to exceed $300 per ton of finished product to sell it, but it might turn out that you can collect tipping fees. You can be paid by the local farm, or perhaps, community waste wood, wherever, that you can be paid and get a second revenue stream, which then in turn helps your margins because that product isn't something that you're just paying to haul. It's something that you're then getting paid to haul. Or, in the case of like a agricultural product project, if you have, a farmer who's busy, um, too busy to take on a significant project, that's where finding a project manager, finding some part-time help, whether that be part-time finance, operations, helping with fundraising, so on and so forth. Really encourage you as you go through his questions and you face his challenges, don't necessarily look at them as disqualifiers, although feedstock certainly can be, but looking for where the other opportunities are to make the project work. So then cost drivers and costing. If we look at a classification of getting a project off the ground, there tend to be, I would say, two main sets of costs, which are the development costs and then the capital costs. I'm going to continually reference Luke, but as he mentioned, the development costs are often costs that an investment firm or bank aren't going to want to front the money for, because at this stage, projects are still super risky. My pellet mill example shows how a project can go and spend almost $1 million and then realize that it's not feasible and then ends up being a no-go. The whole point of the development costs are to get the project to the point where the feasibility is understood to be possible, and then line up the ducks to move forward with the capital aspect of the project, which could be, site preparation and building, connecting with the grid, the equipment that's needed. These are the types of expenses that then open up the project. Once it's deemed feasible, once they have their feedstock and their customers, this is where you can get investment involved. And of course, that's a very good thing because this is where projects typically take the most money. This was kind of an illustrative slide for a certain community scale project. The whole point of the slide is to really show there's so many different there's so many different cost categories. It's important to really dive into each one and get an understanding of what it's going to cost. So, for example, your processing equipment, it's not just enough to say, understand the price tag of the big equipment, but you also need to know how much of the control is going to cost, how much are the conveyors to get product from one machine to the other, how much is it going to cost to actually connect that equipment. It's laborious, it's exhausting, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty as you start to dig into capital costs. But it's truly necessary for the success of your project to try to get the best idea. Traditionally, for capital projects, you would say a contingency of 10 to 15%. But as Luke mentioned, with projects in California routinely running 100%, 200% over budget, it's important to also consider much larger contingencies and having access to capital if there are delays, if projects require the scope of the work changes. If we go through another period of significant inflation, given that you might be planning to buy equipment in 2 years, that can be 2 years in which prices continue to go up. So, not just securing the money, but really having a roadmap for how to get additional money if something goes south, because it almost always takes more time and costs significantly more money. We always used to say when I was building out factories for my frozen dessert business is that it's going to take twice as long as we think, and it's going to cost twice as much. And with that estimate, I think we were unfortunately still off the mark. So then getting back to feedstock, there can be huge differences in the cost. The geography is probably the single biggest factor. These are some exemplary costs. If you're looking at forest thinnings, that's going to often mean, getting specialized equipment that can go down forest roads. The materials might be dispersed and might have to have loading equipment and such in order to get the equipment into the truck. Being a potentially long process, that cost can be significantly more than obtaining fuel that's obtaining biomass that are mill residuals and are all nicely placed on a concrete pad and ready to be loaded up, or agricultural byproducts. So distance matters. How the material is delivered, how it's obtained can play a huge role. And of course, probably the single biggest determinant of your feedstock cost is going to be current fuel prices. And as we've seen lately, you can't necessarily plan on those being constant, if there's a geopolitical event that occurs. But general rule of thumb for feedstock is that you're going to be in a pretty good place if you can obtain your feedstock within, say, 30 miles or so. Depending on what your product is, what you're processing, the scale of your project, that 30 miles isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule, but there is a huge economic advantage to being geographically close to your feedstock. And for those that are earlier on in their projects, I would encourage them to consider placing your project, in close proximity to feedstocks. It's not uncommon, say, to have a pellet mill that's co-located with a wood mill, because that feedstock is available, literally hundreds of feet away rather than tens of miles, which drastically lowers the cost and provides a real competitive advantage for getting a business like that off the ground. And then, we hear a lot, of course, about cost overages, and they're really important to consider and try to anticipate where they can come from. I know, as a 20-something-year-old with my first major capital project, I was very optimistic on my Excel spreadsheets about how those costs would come in. And that unfortunately can almost kill a project. In my case, it was building out a small scale facility, just as the 2007, 2008 economic downturn hit. So it made it very hard to crawl out of that hole. We're fortunate that we did. But the more honest you can be with yourself, the more you can understand your numbers and have an idea of how those numbers could change, the better off you'll be. Because nobody was ever upset when they turned a project on and they had extra money in the bank, even if it leads to extra dilution and such. It's much better than the alternative of running out of money, which can be very expensive and lead to having to give up control of a project, or potentially just simply go out of business before you ever have revenue. So here in California, permitting delays are a known risk, and it can be infuriating. But looking at CEQA, for example, it could be 6 to 18 months just for the initial study. These projects can take years, and it's important to budget for that in the development costs. Many lenders will not lend on a project until it's ready until it is permitted and ready for construction. So it's important to understand how long the projects can take, what is the kind of upper limit of what they might take, and what financial resources it will take to get to that point. Then, another big risk is emission controls. Those of course, can be a moving target. but depending on your project, if you're combusting material, and of course it's dependent upon the location, there can be some very expensive filtering technology and scrubbing technology that's required in order to make your project something that can be permitted by the local authorities. Then feedstock storage and handling. Simply, having the space at your facility to handle your feedstock, especially if it's prone to seasonal availability, whether that be woody biomass from a forest that's only accessible 6 months out of the year because of snow, or if it's an agricultural product like nutshells that are only available once a year. It's important to build in the appropriate amount of storage in which product is stored under the correct environmental conditions, which might mean inside, in order to be able to operate your facility year round. And then, a lot of times the focus is on the development and the capital costs, but you also really need to think about, okay, so we did it. We got over all these hurdles. We have our facility. We're ready to turn it on. We have our customers. We start selling product. Depending whom you're selling to, your off-takers may not pay you for 30 to 60 days. If you're, say, selling a retail product to Home Depot, they might not pay you for the first 90 days or so. So you have to have that working capital in order to get you not just to the point you can flip the switch and start selling product, but where you can ultimately start getting paid by your customer and carry the amount of inventory that it takes to get to that point. And then that, for depending on the product, if you're doing something more consumer facing, the example of the pellet mill I was working with, we were looking at tens of thousands of dollars just to buy bags, that were going to sit there. It was going to be like 6 months worth of bags because of a large minimum production run size. So it's important to understand what it takes. Once the facility is ready to go, what do you need to really get the business going and stay in business? And that also ties in with your inventory carrying costs. If you're doing something agricultural that's seasonal, you're going to have to pay for the feedstock. Potentially either you're going to be storing the feedstock or you're going to create finished product, but potentially be sitting on it for months, if not, in excess of a year. It's important to have the capital in order to facilitate that and not run out of money, not be able to not pay your lease or your bank note, and of course, those all important workers. Then, economic basics of project economics. I think the two most important things to consider are, simple payback. How long is this project going to take to pay back? Whether you're borrowing money from family members to get a project off the ground, from the federal government or through the federal government with various loan programs, from a bank. The most important thing that lenders are going to care about is how are they going to get paid back and when. If a project is going to take 5 years to pay back, that might seem feasible, but if it's going to be something that is going to take 30 years because the margins are so slim, or the revenue that can be generated off of a significant capital investment is relatively low, it's going to be a really different consideration for a lender. And then one of the measures of what we're looking at with payback is going to be the debt service coverage ratio. Basically understanding on an annual basis, how much cash is free to pay back that loan, and how does that relate to the loan itself. As I said earlier, it's most of us are going to pursue projects that have one main source of revenue, whether that be a soil amendment, whether that be pellets or biofuels. But it's also important to understand what other revenue sources are available that can dramatically change your project. So if that's, tipping fees from going around and collecting biomass from those that need to dispose of it, that can absolutely be a game changer. Or what are the carbon credits that are available for your project? Really important to understand those and take full advantage of any potential source of revenue to help with your payback and with your debt service coverage ratio. So here are a couple simple examples. One case A is example of municipal heat. In this project, we're assuming $450,000 was spent was borrowed on the project. They were previously spending $85,000 on propane for this heat, but now with the operational facility, it's only costing them $25,000. So they're coming out $60,000 ahead each year, divided by $450,000. That would be 7.5 years to pay back. Case B, theoretical tribal combined heat and power. This is a $3 million project. It's replacing, $280,000 spent previously on heat and power, but it's costing them $180,000 a year to operate. So their cash flow is only $100,000, 280 minus 180, $100,000 at a time. And this is a simple calculation, no interest. $100,000 a year, it takes 30 years to repay this theoretical project. So that becomes much less appealing to a bank. A 30-year project, and it might exceed the expected useful life of that equipment. And then in these examples, when we look at the debt service coverage ratio, we could go with the assumption of $35,000 of debt per year to pay back on the 450, but they're generating 60,000 in cash flow each year. So a healthy debt service coverage ratio of 1.7. And this won't come as a surprise, but the project that's taken 30 years to repay, they're having to pay back, because of $3 million loan, $175,000 a year, but they're only generating $100K a year. So they're behind. They're under one. When your debt service coverage ratio is under one, you are not generating enough cash each year to pay back your bank loan. And that's going to be, that's going to be a stamp of disapproval from the underwriters. They're just not going to lend money if they have good reason to believe they're not going to get paid back, in a timely business. But that's where we, really want to explore grants, because they can fundamentally change the economics of a project. That project with a 0.57 debt service coverage ratio, if they can get half of that in the form of a grant, they're all of a sudden, at least in the yellow, where the debt service coverage ratio is more than one, only slightly more than one. So there would still be an area for concern. But if somehow they're able to get $2 million in grants, that completely changes the economics of the project, and it pushes the case B, the tribal combined heat and power, to similar economics as the initial municipal heat project that was really favorable from a banking perspective. So then moving into the last section of early stage planning, kind of a very simplified roadmap of what a project could look like in terms of right now, many of you are probably at the stage where you have a concept and you're eager to get going, to get it to the point where you're constructing your facility and getting ready to operate. These timelines, just like the finances of every project, will be distinct for each person, but you can probably learn a lot more from the timelines of other similar projects in your areas than you can learn necessarily from the economics of how much things might cost. Um, so, you know, highly encourage people to take the, early feasibility work very seriously. That might be the step that saves you a lot of heartache from going down the road of developing a project that may or may not ultimately be feasible. And this is the area where you really start to learn about what you're going to do and start thinking about the big questions of where's the feedstock coming from? Where are we going to offload it from? Will the facility be? How much will it take? And the good news is, obviously government funding for projects it has become more challenging in recent years, but there are government grants both from the USDA, including from the Forest Service, and also from the state of California. They are highly competitive. Their deadlines can kind of open and close and be rolling. But if you're going forth with a project and you're doing your work and presenting a good case as to why this project will help the goals of these organizations with forest health, with environmental safety, with innovation in the area of wood products, there is money out there. So highly encourage folks, and we will get into that in the third webinar in financing. We'll get into the grant programs a bit, but to start understanding what those are. But the sad truth with any sort of biomass project is that it's not going to be quick. It's not going to be 2 years and all of a sudden you're up and running. Most projects are looking at 5 to 8 years, and depending on the project, where it is, the challenges in getting to environmental compliance, challenges from local populations. There's all these factors that can unfortunately make those 8 years even longer. So, get ready for a challenging ride. But of course, when you come out on the other side, there's a lot of important work to be done. So, homework for those who are exploring projects. You have your worksheets. I would challenge everybody before the next webinar to, first of all, contact one potential off-taker or more than one. If you have the ability to diversify your revenue stream, that is much better, just in case one doesn't work out. Let's say you're, in the Sacramento Valley, your product is some sort of biochar or soil amendment. It's feasible that you could come up with a bunch of different potential off-takers. Those letters of intent down the road could make the difference between being able to finance your project or not. Tied in with that would be looking into what are the feedstocks that your project will require and understanding where they might come from, and also understanding, is that source going to be available long term, right? If we look at, say, biomass available from a recent fire, that might be available for the next few years, but as the forest is restored, that might not be available longer term for your project. So starting to do the homework into what is available on the feedstock side, where it's available, potential costs, and what other competition there is for that feedstock can really go a long way. And then calling your air district. This is right up there with calling the IRS, but understanding what can be permitted, what is allowable, and what technologies will be required for the type of project that you're looking at undertaking, and can it work? How can it work in harmony with the rules and the population within your local air district? And That is it for now. We're going to move into the Q&A. I think we have about 12 minutes or so. Like I said, I'm Neal Gottlieb. I think my email is in the initial invite. I'm happy to help explore projects with people. My role for those on the call would be helping explore the early economic feasibility of projects, helping to set up the financial model, understand the costing, and hopefully remove headaches later on. So thank you very much for those that attended today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Neal. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I'll just go from the top. The first one was, what collateral might there be for loans in this type of enterprise?
Yes, so the collateral, one of the interesting things about the loan programs through the USDA is they're not lenders, but what they do is cover a good amount of the collateral, I think often up to 90%. So the US government is saying, hey, we're not going to give you money directly, but we're going to work with a local bank and we'll assume, depending on the program, and we can get into specifics that'll be the third webinar, they'll cover up to 90% of the collateral. So you'll still have to have some skin in the game, but it's much less daunting than saying having to collateralize or having to provide personal guarantees on 100% of the project cost.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our next question from Nina is, are there technical assistance providers in this specific biomass space who can provide advising on the business planning and financial modeling side of things?
There are, of course, we have Valley Vision, but a lot of it ends up being sporadic. There's a lot of kind of different consultants out there that sometimes work directly with organizations, also, serve as independent consultants. So it's definitely somewhat piecemeal. One thing to do, if you know others who have worked in the space, would be simply, ask them whom they've worked with in order to get over the finish line. And then, Lindsey, you have other resources, right?
Yes. Yeah, feel free to email me about your project, and happy to connect people. I think so here at Valley Vision, we're happy to help. I saw Elisa Brown has a lot of examples of feasibility studies and bioenergy projects. And so she's a great resource, but happy to connect you with folks that could help with your specific idea or project. If you got here today, you probably got my email, but I'll be emailing the resources out again with my contact information. So that's a great way to get a hold of me. And thank you, Adrian put it in the chat for everyone too. Is there any other questions for Neal today? I know you went over a lot, Neal. Thank you so much for putting that together and going in depth about kind of the feasibility portion and costing. And it's really important kind of to get these challenges, like you said, identified, and how we can mitigate the risks for these projects and build pathways forward. Neal will be joining us again for our second and third webinars, so we'll continue to build as we move forward. Thank you again, Neal, for your time. And could you share the webinar chat? Yes, we can. There was a lot of great, I saw a lot of great introductions going on in the webinar chat today. We had off-takers, we had local government, consultants, so a lot of great resources and connections from just being here today. So thank you so much for attending and making it a valuable time together. Please, within the email that I'll send out along with that, will have this recording and resources, also a link to help provide feedback, because we want to make sure that these are really impactful and beneficial, and we are giving you and providing the information that is needed to get these projects kind of moving forward and more up and running and operational. So I don't know, Sam, if you have any last words for us.
Sure, yeah. Before we do that, just wanted to pick up one more question in the chat, asking for Neal's contact information. Is that something we're going to
Oh,
send out? Neal, do you want to share that
yeah,
here?
I'll add that in the chat. Yeah. And I will, as far as resources for feasibility, I was just looking through the chat and seeing who is here. Regine Miller from Headwaters Environmental, who's the person that connected Lindsey and I. She's runs a small consultancy, is a great resource to help with feasibility for biomass projects.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, Lindsey, did we have a final poll, or are we going to send that out as a follow-up?
We'll send it out as a follow-up for today. But
Great,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate your time. Really appreciate Neal and Luke for coming today and working with us. And hopefully everybody had a chance to learn a lot about how to stand up a project and what to consider. And a big thank you to Lindsey for putting together this series. And we look forward to having Neal back for the next two. Thank you, everybody, and have a
Thanks
good
a lot,
day.
everyone. And do your homework.
Fun.